Hello and welcome to Defence Line, a weekly program on defence, security and more. In this episode of Defence Line, we discuss the defence budget for the coming year, which has been presented in the Parliament by the Union Finance Minister. For the first time, the defence allocation is less than 2% of the gross domestic product, the GDP. Will this be enough for the proposed defence acquisitions? Do we need more money to meet the security threat from two fronts? This is what we will discuss in today's episode of Defence Line. Joining us for the discussion are Colonel Dr. P.K. Vasudeva, a retired officer, Defence and Security Analyst and Director, Bharati Vidya Bhavan, Chandigarh; Brigadier Kiran Krishan, a retired officer, Defence and Security Analyst and Media Columnist; Lieutenant General Vijay Oberoi, former Vice Chief of Army Staff and Defence Commentator; and Air Vice Marshal H.P.S. Sidhu, former Assistant Chief of Integrated Defence Staff in the Ministry of Defence. Welcome to the studio, gentlemen. But before we get into the discussion, let us look at the defence budget for this year.
To aid rapid modernization of the armed forces, India has increased its annual defence spending by about 11.59%. Finance Minister Pranab Mukherjee has allocated Rs 1,64,415.19 crore for the military in 2011-2012. This amounts to an increase of Rs 17,071 crore. More than 40% of the defence budget will be spent on capital expenditure, while the rest will go towards maintaining one of the world's largest standing armed forces. For new purchases and developing military infrastructure, the capital outlay has been ramped up to Rs 69,199 crore, a 15.33% increase from 2010-2011. Under the capital outlay, the Army would get Rs 18,988.04 crore, the Navy Rs 5,688.72 crore, the Naval Fleet Rs 7,320.02 crore, the Air Force Rs 29,722.74 crore, and Defence Research and Development Rs 4,628.30 crore. The revenue outlay too has been hiked by 9% at Rs 95,216 crore. Of the revenue expenditure, Rs 64,251.55 crore would go to the Army, Rs 10,589.06 crore to the Navy, Rs 15,927.95 crore to the Air Force, and Rs 5,624.81 crore to Defence Research and Development. Compared to the 2010-2011 hike of 3.9%, the defence budgetary increase for 2011-2012 seems huge. In 2009-2010, the defence budget had witnessed a whooping 34% hike over the previous year. The hefty increase suggests the government plans to move ahead with a slew of planned defence acquisitions, including a $10.5 billion fighter jet contract, one of the world's largest on offer. India's neighbours China and Pakistan are estimated to be spending over $90 billion and $10 billion annually respectively on their military. China had set its defence spending at $78 billion last year, while the core US defence budget excluding war funding was $530 billion.
We will be in conversation with General Oberoi, AVM Sidhu, Brigadier Krishan and Colonel Vasudev. General Oberoi, let me start with you.
Yeah.
There has been a 11.5% hike in the defence budget. But given our security scenario, do you think that is adequate?
No, not at all. In fact, listening to the budget speech, I thought the speech was not meant for the defence services at all. It was a popular speech. Elections were to be announced the next day, which they have been announced now. And defence came in as a small little paragraph, as an afterthought, it seems to me. Because you cannot look at the defence budget only in terms of whether it is an increase or a decrease from last year. This year-to-year business does not work. The only way of calculating the correct defence budget is the percentage of GDP. And the defence budget has been falling, not since last year, since the last 15 years. And if
the defence allocation of the GDP this time is less than 2%, 1.8%.
It is 1.8%. I mean, never heard of before. It has never been as low as this. Even the defence minister goes after the event and announces it should have been 2.5. The military has been asking for 3. And if the defence minister has to say 2.5, that means he has no clout. Is the finance minister who juggles all the figures and presents it to you. I'm most disappointed by this budget.
General Oberoi, the standing committee of the parliament has been suggesting a 3%, the defense allocation should be 3% of the GDP.
Quite right.
Do you think the government doesn't have enough money, or is it that there is a lack of awareness as far as security aspect is concerned?
The point is, our political leaders of all parties, mind you, not just the present people in power, have no knowledge about security issues. Neither do they want to learn.
You've been at the very highest levels as the vice chief. So when you are interacting with the people in the Ministry of Defence and in the government, is that the feeling that you got?
Oh yes, they don't talk to us. They talk to the bureaucrats, bureaucrats talk to us, we talk to the bureaucrats talk to us.
That looks like a very scary scenario.
But it is like that.
ABM Sidhu, reduction in the defence budget in terms of the GDP, for the second time in 30 years it appears, we've fallen below 2%. How do you explain that?
As General Oberoi said, it's the government's commitment to the elections that are coming up, and they had to show increase in social expenditure. Actually, another point to note is, for the first time in a decade, the social sector expenditure is higher than the defense budget.
That's right.
And that's good. As a citizen, I think one can't really crib about it. But the defense budget should be related to the security scenario. Indian Ocean is now very much a responsibility of the Indian Armed Forces, increasingly so for the Air Force. I talk particularly for the Air Force and the Navy. And those are capital intensive expenditures, and we got to relate it to that security scenario. China is modernizing. We got to enhance infrastructure all along the northern and the western borders. We got to look at that capital expenditures. And I quite rightly agree with General Oberoi. If you just look at it in wholesome figures, 9% growth of GDP, the gross amount is higher by 10%.
I think that is hardly enough. It offsets the inflation at all.
So it's, in figures wise, very impressive. 17,000 crores higher and 11% higher. But it just doesn't relate to the Indian national security scenario, and that's important.
It doesn't relate to the national security scenario. Brigadier Krishnan, do you agree with that? Even the Defence Minister, as General Oberoi mentioned, he talked in terms of 2.5, the defence budget being 2.5 of the GDP. Do you agree with that figure? Do you think it should be more or about the same?
I have slightly differing views. GDP is one measure of comparing military expenditure as percentage of GDP. Another more true estimate would be as percentage of the national budget, total national budget, and by that figure it has generally been at 13% starting from year 1988. There is no change. Well, the only thing I would say is that India keeps sending an important message time and time again that we are a status quo power. We don't make any threats to anyone. We are not a threat to Pakistan, we are not a threat to China. To that extent, well, it meets the government requirement.
But Brigadier Krishnan, don't you think in certain ways these figures during the budget are only notional? For example, last year in the last budget, whatever figure was mentioned for the defence budget, actually the defence services got more than that. So that's the silver lining. I mean, even the finance minister mentioned that if the defence services need more money, it will be forthcoming.
Well, last year was the only year when we managed to spend the money. So,
It is a
very question of silver lining. I think, General Oberoi has been right. So many hurdles have been created. In fact, it is a mess totally.
Colonel Vasudeva, our neighbors spend anything from 2.5 to 4% of their GDP on defence. What do you think should be the figure for us?
Before answer this question, I'll give you another very surprising about the GDP. The 13th Financial Commission in January 2010 announced that the defense budget as per the GDP ratio should come down to 1.76% by 2014 and 2015. This shows...
So that means the finance minister is working towards that.
Policy makers at the helms of affairs are not aware what our adversaries, that is China and Pakistan, are doing. Every year they are increasing their GDP ratio towards the defense budget. China has gone 7.5%, $78 billion, and next week it is going to announce its budget, and experts says is going to $100 billion, which is more than twice that of India. Why? It has gone right up to our borders where you are still foot slogging. They have deployed their aircraft, they have deployed their missiles and railway lines. Even the roads have been, buses are coming right up to that. That means country is sleeping over
But
this.
Colonel Vasudev, as AVM Sidhu said, a lot of this money which has been not given to defense has been given to into the social sector. This money for the allocation for education and health is higher. Don't you think that's where the country needs to spend more money?
I don't agree with it. You can't compromise national security and defense with that of the social security. Where will the social security will be? We will be in the same state what we were in 1962 when we were caught with the pen storm. This sort of situation, I am afraid, is going to happen.
But after all, this is all that the money you have in the kitty. So where do you give money to these sectors then if you don't compromise somewhere?
I agree with you.
Why is the government not decreasing the subsidies, which actually don't reach the people to whom they are supposed to reach? They fill up the pockets of all the government servants and down the chain. The government is taking a loss in terms of taxation and excise because they are giving sops to the corporates. They need the money for the elections and money comes from the corporate. Now, if there is a downslide of excise and customs and other taxes, then obviously they have to meet it from somewhere else. But it seems to be that because of lack of understanding of what the security of the nation is, the people sitting in the finance ministry, and I include the babus and I also include the netas, who say, okay, take on the army, it's all right. Army means military, it's all right. Who's bothered? But I think what the valid point which Vasu has made is, look at China. It is baring its teeth every week, either in Ladakh or in Arunachal Pradesh or in passports or in roads leading into Nepal or into all the infrastructure.
Absolutely. So you mean we need to cut down elsewhere if at all we have to
it is not a question of if you butter and guns finished with the First World War. Our people still quote butter and guns. There is no such thing as butter and guns today. Today the importance is security for economic planning and economic growth. So you can't have just economic growth and no security, and you can't have security and no economic planning and no economic growth. They both have to go side by side. We need to cut down in other things, wasteful efforts which are being made.
Brigadier Krishnan, I want to check with you. We all talked about China. So in this case, since both China and Pakistan seem to be joining hands and we often hear of this, do you agree with what General Oberoi said?
Well, to an extent, yes. But number one, Pakistan and China joining hands and attacking India together, it is a far-fetched scenario. I don't agree with that at all. Pakistan is on the downslide. It has lots of its own problems. China is using Pakistan as a cat's paw against India. Secondly, China, it's not in China's interest to go in for a 1962 type of a war against India. China is a rising power, it's an economic power. I don't think they're interested in it.
So you don't see an immediate threat?
No, not at all. But to say that we shouldn't be working on our defense, well, that would be a wrong thing to say.
All right, here we'll take a short break. When we return, we continue our discussion on the defense budget. We are discussing if the defense allocation in this year's budget is good enough to meet the security challenges facing the country. AVM Sidhu,